Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. So it's my great privilege to introduce Sugata Ray, who I first met at the Getty, I think, so is it, like 15 years ago, something like that. But anyway, so it's great to see you here in Lahore. Sugata is an associate professor of South and Southeast Asian art and architecture in the Department of History of Art, and also in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, and director of the South Asia Art Initiative and the Climate Change Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley. His research is on post-1400s art and architecture in South Asia, with a focus on climate change and the environment, postcolonial philosophy, geophilosophy, and posthumanist thought. Ray's many publications include Climate Change and the Art of Devotion, Geoaesthetics in the Land of Krishna, 1550 to 1850, and Water Histories of South Asia, the Materialities of Liquescence, coedited. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sugata Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the very kind introduction, and let me thank Iftikhar and John for organizing this wonderful gathering, talking about birds and gathering. I would also take this opportunity to thank the Lahore Biennale Foundation, and especially their wonderful staff for making everything possible. So my sincere gratitude for my first visit to Lahore. On that note, let me begin. In 1600, Jacob von Neck's report of the second Dutch expedition to Indonesia was published in Amsterdam. When the second edition appeared in the very next year, an engraving titled, "How We Live in the Island of Mauritius, otherwise named Docene," was included in the report. As the first published image of the dodo, the flightless pigeon entered global history in the shadow of the 1598 Dutch expedition to Asia. Within a century, the bird was extinct. In fact, all three identified species in the engraving, the Mauritius giant tortoise, the dodo, and the broad-billed parrot, would be extinct soon after due to deforestation, indiscriminate hunting, and the introduction of non-indigenous animals such as rats, cats, and pigs. The Anthropocene extinction, or the age of human-induced mass extinction, was thus inaugurated. While scholars point towards James Watt's design of the steam engine in the mid-18th century or atomic testing in the mid-20th century as pivotal conjunctions in the Anthropocene, or the period in which human activity becomes the dominant force on the environment, European ecological imperialism from the 1500s can be seen as an equally devastating origin story of our current mass biodiversity extinction. Often described as the sixth mass extinction, the most cataclysmic extinction event after the dinosaurs went extinct around 65 million years ago, the loss of vertebrate animal species, for instance, has moved forward 24 to 85 times faster after 1500 than during the Cretaceous mass extinction. And these are only a few examples of the various Indian Ocean species that went extinct from the 1500s onwards. There is no doubt that the origin story of our current ecological crises is entwined with the history of settler colonialism that impelled the annihilation of human and non-human life on an unprecedented worldly scale. Yes, yet, despite the longue durée thanatopolitics of the sixth mass extinction that accelerated the demise of both individual species and the collapse of entire ecological systems, the philosopher Tom Van Doren asked, and these are his words, "What kind of human-bird relationships are possible at the edge of extinction? What does it mean to care for a disappearing species? What obligations do we have to hold open space in the world for other living beings?" Taking Van Doren's concept of avian entanglements as a provocation, I want to turn today to accounts of human-bird relationships in the Indian Ocean world to obfuscate overdetermined narratives of European biogovernance that led to the extinction of species such as the dodo. As I and many others have argued, an engagement with the non-human solely through a top-down paradigm that focuses on imperial mediations in ordering, managing, and mastering life runs the risk of overlooking the small voices of history. And I'm obviously quoting from Ranojit Guho's oft-cited phrase that endured despite European ecological imperialism. If the complex matrix of post-1500s European ecological imperialism that led to the extinction of innumerable species in the Indian Ocean world is the origin story of our besieged present, other speculative accounts of avian entanglements might take us to Nusra Latif Qureshi's The Conference of Birds, where the shadowy silhouettes of feathered creatures haunt our anthropogenic present. Birds are everywhere, and I want to thank Matt Cox, who's the curator of this exhibition that literally opens in 48 hours in Australia. In a panel from The Desire of Memory, the veritable hoopoe, the messenger of Solomon in the Quran, appears in profile. The genesis of this avian narrative, of course, leads us back to the mystic poet Fakhruddin Attar's Speech of the Bird, completed in the last quarter of the 12th century. As the chronicle goes, birds from across the land had gathered to select their avian leader. Among the many who gathered, it was the hoopoe who steered the collective on their journey across 7 valleys to Mount Kaf, where the legendary Simurgh lives. As many have argued, the bird's voyage across vast terrains was an allegory for the stages of the Sufi path. Attar's 12th century enunciation of love for the divine, shaped as it were through speech-bearing birds, should not surprise us. Shape-shifting non-human animals populated the cosmological and political horizons of the medieval Indian Ocean world. In Ibn al-Muqaffa's Qalila and Dimna, the widely circulating 8th century Arabic book of fables, based in part on the Sanskrit Panchatantra, the two protagonist jackals, Qalila and Dimna, appear as political savants relating enduring narratives of statecraft, governance, and politics. Illustrated versions of this text were produced in South Asia as well from the 15th century onwards, and this one, for instance, was produced in Gujarat and the West Coast, alongside the circulation of text such as the Speech of Birds in Sufi circles. It is then no coincidence that the illustrious Mughal emperor Jahangir revisited Attar's ecological vision of the celestial and earthly realms when he commissioned the court artist Abul Hasan to paint the emperor shooting his arch enemy, the Abyssinian Malik Ambar. Abul Hasan, who had been awarded the title Nadir al-Zaman, rarity of the times, pictorially translated Attar's lyrical image of the earth, inhabited by various animals and birds, into a political allegory of Mughal kingship. As Attar writes, since earth rests firmly on the back of the cow, and the cow on the fish, and the fish on air, so what is it all on? On nothing. Nothing being nothing, all of this is nothing but nothing. In Abul Hasan's rendition, the Emperor Jahangir stands on a European globe which rests on the haunts of a cow and a fish, other birds such as owls, the symbol of darkness, and the mythical Huma associated with ideas of kingship complete this picture of Mughal sovereignty. While scholars have written extensively on the inclusion of an European globe in the painting as articulating Jahangir's worldly outlook, the painting simultaneously evokes the human, non-human assemblages that were at the core of expansive imaginaries of the planet in the pre-colonial world. The philosophical underpinnings of such a capacious imaginary, in turn, offers us a genealogical antecedent to rethink the diverse indexes of human-non-human relations in intellectual traditions outside of post-Enlightenment Western Europe. Jahangir, after all, had also built a magnificent memorial to his beloved antelope, Hansraj, in Shikupura near Lahore after the animal passed away. And I'm really happy that we get to visit the site collectively tomorrow. We can talk more about how we think about human-animal relationships. Furthermore, the emperor noted in his personal memoirs, "On account of the rarity of the above-mentioned antelope, I ordered that no one molest the antelope of this plain, and that their flesh would be like the flesh of cows for the infidel, and like the flesh of pigs for Muslims. I also commanded a gravestone made in the shape of an antelope and erected." And over the last 2 days, I have been looking for this gravestone, and I found a couple of sculptures, including this one in the Lahore Museum. There's one more I found today at the Lahore Fort. So there are some sculptures of this antelope, and again, it offers us a way of thinking about not just species level, but an individual animal, Hansraj. But speaking of entanglements of the intellectual kind, can we, too, envisage a practice of living that foregrounds a contingent correlation of equivalence with non-human worlds in our time, in our catastrophic time, a time in which environmental precarity has etched its mark on every aspect of life? In his book, Flightways, Van Doren shows that the imminent extinction of the long-billed vulture in South Asia, due to their unintentional consumption of the drug diclofenac administered to cattle, is having manifold consequences across the human-non-human divide. As vultures perish due to poisoning, other species, including humans, are being affected by the decaying bodies that are no longer swiftly disemboweled by the scavenging bird. As scientists have also noted, in the absence of the long-billed vulture, anthrax will pose a considerable health crisis alongside potential contamination of soil and waterways. It is in this context that Van Doren proposes the idea of avian entanglements as an entangled community that centers on the critically endangered vultures, but also draws in humans, cattle, and a host of other species. It is also in this context of the slow violence of our current planetary crisis that I propose returning anew to an imagination of planetary living that is alert to the vitalism of more than human actants and actors and other minor ways of being in alterity that have all but been marginalized by the ruthless forces of global capitalism. The globe, we might recall, materialized in the age of the modern world picture. Our planet was discursively transfigured into a terrestrial globe with the 1519 Magellan expedition of the Earth, or a circumnavigation of the Earth, while attempting to search for a western route to Southeast Asia. Lavish maps, for example this one, illustrating the expedition route were produced soon after by European cartographers for empire-building projects in the Indian Ocean world. The result was the production of an oceanic space that could be transmuted into a measurable natural resource to reinforce the global flow of capital. The world, with all its myriad life forms, could also be, in Martin Heidegger's word, conceived and grasped as a picture in its totality thereafter. And in our pixelated age, the globe, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak writes, and she wrote this around 20 years ago, the globe is on our computer. No one lives there. It allows us to think we can control it. The planet is in the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and we inhabit it on loan. For Spivak, the global is then connected to the alienation of the neo-colonial apparatuses that link post-1500 territorial empires to current transnational capitalism. After all, long before the founding of Wall Street, the world's first stock exchange was established in Amsterdam in 1602, following the institution of the Dutch East India Company's imperial networks in Asia. And it is in this context that we may also turn our attention to European collecting practices and the Dutch East India Company's commercial and territorial interests in Mauritius and the Indian Ocean world more broadly in accelerating the catastrophic violence of the Anthropocene extinction. The Kunstkammer of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburg ruler Rudolf II in Prague, not only included a taxidermied dodo, and this is a painting of the dodo that was in the Kunstkammer of Rudolf II, but also a dystopian collection of bones, shells, feathers, and horns of other now extinct or endangered species, such as the Seychelles nuts and the Sumatran serau. Valued as a cure for colic, paralysis, and nervous ailments, and I'm quoting Garcia, the Portuguese doctor Garcia Horta's 1563 book on medicinal plants in Asia, the Seychelles nuts was extensively collected, displayed in Kunstkammers, used for medicinal purposes, and exchanged as diplomatic gifts by European royalty and elite alike. The exceptional value placed on the Seychelles nuts, Rudolf II, for instance, once paid 3,000 florins for one nut, consequently led to the over-harvesting of this prized biocommodity over the subsequent century. And currently, there are only 8,000 trees of this endangered species in Seychelles. The dodo, of course, went extinct long before the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of fossil fuels, and the acidification of the oceans, while the Sumatran serau, endemic to Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, is currently endangered. That Dutch colonialism in Mauritius was directly responsible for the extinction of the dodo was not contested in the historical archive. As early as 1639, the German diplomat Johann Albrecht von Mandelso witnessed the wholesale slaughter of birds in Mauritius with cudgels. In 1648, a report of a Dutch sailor's account from Mauritius was published with this engraving, depicting the slaughter of dodos, sea cows, and other species endemic to the island. Although the bird depicted here is a penguin rather than a dodo, the text in Dutch identifies the bird as a dronten, which is the Dutch word for solen and often used to talk about the dodo. As environmental historians have noted, within a century of occupation, the Dutch had managed to bring about great changes in the fragile island's ecology through the introduction of non-indigenous animals, deforestation, which led to because of demands of ebony, and the setting up of monocrop plantations. This drawing now in the Netherlands State Archive is one of the earliest portrayals of colonial deforestation in the Indian Ocean world. And one of the birds here is a dodo, somewhere here. Again, one of the very few illustrations of the species in its natural lowland ebony forest habitat. Also note that we have species such as pigs, a stag, and a goat introduced by the Dutch. The dodo goes extinct, land tortoises go extinct within a century. Spivak, who conceived of planetarity as best imagined from the pre-capitalist cultures of the planet, once stated that alterity remains underived from us if we imagine ourselves as planetary subjects rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities. Jahangir, on his part, repopulated the modern terrestrial globe, that globe of empire, by re-enchanting it through a citation of Islamic and pre-Islamic imaginations of the planet via the speech of the birds. As for the dodo, the bird also reached South Asia. We know that in 1628, Jahangir's menagerie had 2 of these birds. But certainly the bird had arrived before 1628 in South Asia, as we can see from this painting by the celebrated artist Mansour, who served as a court painter under Jahangir's. Mansour's 1626 painting was a careful study, a likeness, a tasveer of the bird, meticulously applying color in small areas to define the texture and sheen of plumage, the artist accentuated bodily presence through naturalistic verisimilitude. We know that Mansour, who is well regarded for his representation of flora and fauna, had begun his career in the early 1590s under the Emperor Akbar. His signature first appears in this copy of the memoirs of the first Mughal Emperor Babur, which was commissioned by Akbar, and this is signed by Mansour, so we know this is one of the first dated paintings by Mansour. And we can see how there is a keen attentiveness to the natural world already in his early works. But as many art historians have argued, the artist, under the guidance of Jahangir, a consummate naturalist, subsequently inaugurated a new turn in Mughal painterly cultures, one that brought to the forefront a keen attentiveness to the natural world, as can be seen in his paintings of animals such as turkeys, zebras, and even vultures. Without doubt, Mansour's documentary eye paralleled his patron's project of systematically recording and describing the natural world in his imperial memoirs. The artist and the patron are certainly significant. The social life of the 1627 painting of the dodo is also worth noting, even if in passing, for it highlights the trans-regional circulation of Mughal painting. The painting disappears from the Imperial Mughal Library at some point, appears in Tehran before 1730, where it is added to an album now known as the St. Petersburg Murakka. And more on that soon. As we can see, the compiler, whose name we do not know, assembled 5 different paintings on the page. A hanging parrot endemic to Southeast Asia, Mansour's dodo, a bird, the western tragopan endemic to the Himalayas, attributed to the Safavid artist Muhammad Bakir, a bar-headed goose endemic to Central and South Asia, and a sand grouse endemic to South Asia. The background with flowering plants and skies were also added in the 18th century to cover the joints because these are 5 separate paintings. The album comes into the possession of the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Science in 1921, and hence the name St. Petersburg Murakka or album. Documents in the archive of the State Hermitage reveal that Nikolai II, the last reigning emperor of Russia, had acquired the album from Tehran in 1910 for 15,000 rubles for a museum that he had established. And after 1917, the album was transferred to the State Russian Museum, and 1921 it is transferred to the Oriental Studies Institute, then known as the Asiatic Museum, where it is currently housed. At present, the album is missing the first and the last leaf, so where the owner's marks or stamps would be placed, and in most albums, so we do not know who owned it, how it landed up in Tehran. The folios were also torn out and rebound in a completely different order, making it difficult to surmise how this particular collage would function within the internal narrative of the album. And as you can see from the folio, it has a range of paintings. So while it is impossible to reconstruct the order of the folios, the logic of presenting different birds in one single folio certainly harks back to Attar's Speech of the Birds, completed in the 12th century in Nishapur, around 700 kilometers from Tehran. While we will never know if the unknown compiler referred to Attar's poetry or even later Safavid paintings illustrating Attar texts, such as the one by Habibullah of Sawa, who was active during the reign of Shahbaz, the very presence of birds from across the Indian Ocean world undoubtedly offers a glimpse into early modern avian entanglements. Avian entanglements that have been opaque in art history, as non-human animals, lions, sheep, elephants, and other animals, have been seen as symbolic or metaphorical figures that assume allegorical meaning within a system of oratic kingship centered around a worldly cosmopolitan monarch. And incidentally, the painting on the left of Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas on the back of a lion and a lamb, this is an imaginary encounter since this encounter never happened, is also from the St. Petersburg album in which we have the painting of the dodo. What is thereby omitted is the very physical presence of the animal in the coat. An animal studies perspective takes us on a different path. Rather than seeing the bird as an absented trace or merely an amalgamation of lines, shapes, and colors in the masterful hands of the artist Mansour, an animal studies perspective urges us to take seriously the corporeal presence of the dodo, the very physical presence of the bird in the Mughal court. But first, a caveat. Unlike a sovereign subject with authorial intent, the animal does not leave a trace in the archive, unless we talk about Congo, the celebrated chimpanzee in the London Zoo, or other imprisoned animals trained to paint by their captors and keepers. Consequently, we might concede that there is no real animal, a historical subject to be found in art history's species-level archive. And it is solely from within the domain of representation that we have to unearth the human, non-human entanglements engendered by the arrival of the dodo in the Mughal court. The story of the dodo that reached the Mughal court is not surprisingly deeply intertwined with an early modern global economy of the collecting and gifting of exotic animals. Of the numerous unusual animals that circulated across vast oceanic spaces in this period, the dodo from Mauritius that arrived in Amsterdam in 1626 is perhaps the best known today, as immortalized by the Flemish artist Roland Savary, exactly the same time when Mansour is painting his dodo in faraway South Asia. Often considered to be one of the most important dodo paintings by Savary, the landscape is striking in the staging of the fall of man. That the metaphor of loss, with Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, is not set in a hoary biblical past, but in Europe's global present, is evident from the inclusion of a dodo, a bird that had been discovered by the Europeans a few decades earlier, in the right corner. And here is one more example of the painting by Savary, which was owned by the naturalist Hans Sloan and then presented to the British Museum in 1759. Savary's dodos were reproduced over the next few centuries. Even in the 19th century, it served as a model for the bird in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which the extinct bird initiates a caucus race. Also note how the dorsal edge of the beak has been depicted, and as the frontispiece of the first scientific book on the dodo, written by the British naturalists Hugh Strickland and Alexander Melville. The dodo's circulation in Europe was then symptomatic of an early modern global trade that arose in conjunction with new forms of collecting, new natural philosophies, and new biotechnological apparatuses that led to the extinction of the dodo under Dutch colonialism. The practice of collecting exotic animals and birds was, of course, not limited to Europe. Jahangir too, for instance, maintained a menagerie that housed rare animals such as African zebras and American turkeys, and often commissioned the artist Mansour to paint these exotic animals. And both these paintings are done by the artist Mansour. Perhaps Mansour's painting of the dodo was a pictorial response to European engravings of nature studies. Much like the representation of the bird in contemporaneous European natural history, for instance, the woodblock of the American turkey, published in the Italian naturalist Aldrovonde's Ornithology, Mansour's dodo too is presented in side profile. It is, however, worth emphasizing that the technique of presenting an isolated animal against a blank background was, at least in 16th century Europe, representative of what Janis Neri has described as an emergent specimen logic, a form of knowledge production that turned nature into object by decontextualizing select creatures and removing them from their habitats and environments. It is in this context of an early modern European natural history that Aldrovandi's woodblock of the Turkey functioned as a specimen of America's avifauna. It is also within the system of the scientific study of the natural world that the bird came to allegorically signify Europe's claims over the Americas. Exotic birds such as the turkey and the dodo, however, has a very different career in South Asia, for they were not embedded within the discourses of ecological imperialism that marked Europe's interest in either the Americas or Indian Ocean islands such as Mauritius. Along with acquiring the turkey and the dodo, Jahangir, for instance, had started cultivating pineapples in Agra with plants obtained from the Portuguese. The American fruit also starts appearing in textiles. And in this example on the screen, you see this ascetic holding up this wondrous fruit that he has never seen before, a strange fruit from far away. The biocultural effects of the Columbian exchange in Mughal South Asia was then surely rooted in a very different conceptual register, a system that was epistemically unlike the imperialist ambitions of European seaborne colonialism. If the complex matrix of post-1500s European ecological imperialism that led to the extinction of innumerable species in the Indian Ocean world is the origin story of our besieged present, the presence of dodos, turkeys, and other birds in the Mughal court hint towards a different history of avian entanglements beyond ecological imperialism. Although the Mughals collected objects, plants, and animals from diverse parts of the world, they were, as scholars argue, sea-conscious as opposed to a seaborne empire. As a result, one would need to go beyond the totalizing history of European expansionism to comprehend the presence of the dodo and other animals and birds in the Mughal court. Recollect Jahangir's requiem to his beloved antelope. Also recollect Attar's speech of the bird in Abul Hasan's retake of the narrative. But Attar's speech-bearing hoopoe, the hudhud in Arabic, exceeds the bird as envisaged in the Quran. For across medieval and early modern Indian Ocean literary and medicinal cultures, the Eurasian hoopoe was also valorized as a magico-mystical creature. And it is this enchanted bird that also appears in Nusra Latif Qureshi's 2012 painting as a cipher of avian entanglements in our Anthropocene present. It is of some significance that South Asian poets, such as the legendary Mirza Ghalib, often assume the speech of birds. Anthropologist Anant Taneja notes in an essay on the ecological thought of anti-colonial nationalist and leader of the Indian National Congress, Maulana Azad. In a letter dated March 14, 1943, Maulana Azad, for instance, refers to this text, the speech of birds, Attar's 12th century tour de force, to consider, and I'm quoting Maulana Azad here, the transformations that his desires for intimacy with the bird has wrought on him. Indeed, avian entanglements, as enunciated in the speech of birds, seems to have manifested, albeit in amended forms, once again, to offer a new ecological ethics for our global present. But the particular account of speech-bearing birds that I have sketched so far is neither singular nor exceptional. As early as 1962, the American biologist and Rachel Carson had published Silent Spring, a groundbreaking documentation on how the use of DDT as a pesticide irrevocably harmed birds and other animals while contaminating the entire ecological system. Crucially for us, Carson begins Silent Spring with the question of animal speech, or the lack of animal speech, in the age of the sixth mass extinction. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where have they gone? Many people spoke on them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn and chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, herons, and scores of other birds, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. The demise of vultures, robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, among other avian species, consequently forces us to face a conceivable future where the songbird does not sing, and a strange stillness envelops the planet. It is against such an apocalyptic now, the future we could say is already here, that Van Doren offers the concept of avian entanglement, and Carson advocated for ecological interconnectedness that support life. Finally then, notwithstanding the spectral silence that haunts the sixth mass extinction, it is up to us to heed the small voices of birds, not through a fetishized romanticization of the past, but through tracing the obdurate vestiges of pre-capitalist avian entanglements that are almost obliterated by the stranglehold of climate coloniality. As life, contaminated, mutated, radioactive, still perseveres in the shadow of the Anthropocene, listening to the erudite Hoopo might allow us for a different interspecies politics to materialize, one that recenters an animated world where human, non-human binaries become obscure. The procedures for sensing such entanglements across life worlds, we might say, is planetarity by another name. After all, desire, as Eve Tuck and Siri observe, and I'm quoting them here, is a refusal to trade in damage. Desire is an antidote, a medicine to damage narratives. It is the recognition of suffering, the cost of settler colonialism and capitalism, and how we still thrive in the face of loss anyway, the part of us that won't be destroyed. To thrive as planetary subjects, planetary creatures rather than global entities, consequently requires a subtle but vital epistemological shift in our very conception of what is to be human. Thank you.